And welcome to the Old Cemetery Society Sunday afternoon tours and another beautiful day here in paradise at Ross Bay Cemetery. We're here shivering. It's just been raining hard and the wind is howling. We may not go down by the ocean. And so if the wind starts making a mess of the sound, bear with us. We'll try to stay in sheltered places as best we can. We do our tours every Sunday and we're doing them for the foreseeable future by Zoom, but hopefully when the pandemic begins to quieten down, we will start doing in-person tours again as well, probably in addition to Zoom tours too. And each week it's a different topic. This week it's street names in Victoria. My name is John Adams. I'm going to be one of the two presenters, and Yvonne van Ruskenveld, who's standing nearby, is the other presenter today. So you've got two for the price of one. And just a very brief introduction about street names in Victoria. It's a topic that we have done once in a while before, but indeed, every city has streets. Victoria, being a very old city, has street names that perhaps go back into the mists of time, and people aren't quite sure why certain streets are called the way they are. But when the maps were first laid out in the early 1850s by Joe Pemberton, the Surveyor General for the colony of Vancouver Island, he laid out the very first streets. In fact, it said that Government Street, that runs through downtown and all the way through to James Bay, might be the very first street laid out anywhere in what is now Western Canada. Called Government Street because the original colonial government offices were on Government Street in the downtown area. The city expanded with various gold rushes. The original streets were named after people that owned the land. Some of the big names like Douglas and Yates and Johnson. Who's he? Nobody knows these days, but one of the streets was named for him. And then as the city expanded even more, with many outlying subdivisions and the suburban areas, more and more streets were named, quite often after the original landowners, sometimes after a series of people. They might be ships, they might be trees, they might be provinces of Canada. But indeed, we've chosen some of the most interesting ones today, perhaps ones that you've heard of, maybe a few that you haven't. So having said that, by way of introduction, and by the way, street names do change. We'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Yvonne.
Okay, can you hear me? I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us on previous tours where we've had challenges with technology and with the weather. And I'm hoping that today everything will go smoothly. And I'm sure I will hear about it if there is any issues with the sound. So I'm standing here by the Mackenzie Mausoleum, and I'm sure that anybody who has lived in Victoria for any length of time recognizes the name Mackenzie from the very large Mackenzie that runs across above Ubec and along the Lake Hill area of Saanich. And Kenneth Mackenzie was the patriarch of the family. He grew up in Scotland, where he managed his father's estate. But the estate fell on hard times and had to be sold. So he was looking for someplace to go to support his family. By that time, he was middle-aged. He was in his early 40s. And he was hired on by the Puget Sound Agricultural Company to come to the Victoria area and manage one of the farms, the first sort of big farm, Craig Flower Farm. He was hired as what was called the bailiff or manager of the farm, which meant that when he left Scotland, he brought with him, as well as his family, his wife Agnes and their children, he brought with him other workers, farmers, artisans, and some laborers, and some other people just to settle in the area. And they came on the Norman Morrison. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the area might recognize that name. Some people call it the Mayflower of the colony because it brought so many of the early settlers. So they arrived here in January 1853, thinking that they would be, have this great welcome because here they were, this fellow coming to manage this big farm and, bringing all these people, and nothing was ready for them, not a thing. There was no place even for them to live. They were put up at the fort, which was pretty pokey at the time. There's nothing had been done in the farmland. None of it had been broken or anything. It was 600 acres up at the top of the gorge. And Mackenzie considered just turning around and going home. But once he was shown what the land looked like, and of course how beautiful it was here, decided to stay. So the family moved into a log home up there, and the farm started to be developed by the hard work of Mackenzie and his laborers. And they eventually established quite the farm with a lot of animals. They had cattle and sheep and goats and pigs and horses. And they also grew crops, wheat, oats, peas, potatoes, and turnips. It was like a little village. They also had a sawmill, a grist mill, a bakery. They had, of course, there was accommodation for all the laborers and that, cottages and that. The school, Craig Flower School, was developed in 1855, was built then. And the Manor House, which still stands, both the school and the Manor House still stands, was built in 1856. Now, by all accounts, the Mackenzie family are very hospitable. They did a lot of entertaining, including with naval officers from Esquimalt, and generally had quite a good life up there. Unfortunately, the Puget Sound Agricultural Company itself, which included a whole bunch of farms all around the Victoria area, did not do well. The Hudson's Bay Company, who actually owned the Puget Farm Agricultural Company, was not happy with how it was operating. It wasn't making much money for them, and it was a lot of expense. And so in the early 1860s, they disposed of it. Now, Mackenzie was smart enough to buy his own land before that happened. And so he developed his own farm and the lake where Lake Hill is now, it's called Lake Hill area, which is the Quadra and Mackenzie area. And that's why Mackenzie there is named after him, and Craig Flower Road is named after where the farm was. So Craig Flower Manor and of course the schoolhouse still exist. Now Mackenzie died at Lake Hill Farm in 1875, and his wife lived on there for another 20 years, dying in 1873. So we have quite a lot to memorialize this family. Kenneth himself and his wife, Agnes, are actually buried in the ground here, and it's the later members of the Mackenzie family that are buried in this beautiful mausoleum. And now we're just going to move next door to the Pierce grave. It's raining quite a bit now. It wasn't raining hardly at all when we started, but it's raining quite a bit now. And here we have Benjamin Pierce, who's tucked in here between his two wives, Mary Letitia and Jenny. And on his grave marker, it says Fernwood. Now, of course, today we know Fernwood, recognize that name. Some of you maybe even live in Fernwood. And of course, there's Fernwood Road as well. But the Fernwood that's named on the Pierce grave is actually the name of his estate, Fernwood Estate. And that's what the Fernwood neighborhood is named after, and Fernwood Road is named after. So Benjamin Pierce came to Victoria in 1852, and at the ripe old age of 20 years old, he was hired by Joseph Despard Pemberton to be the assistant surveyor for the area. So he worked with Pemberton on surveying the South Island, and he was very lucky, of course, in knowing where the land was and what was what from all the surveying that he did, that he decided on what property he wanted, and he bought it in early 1858, cleverly for him, although he wouldn't have known this, before the Fraser River Gold Rush started and land prices rocketed up. He also very cleverly, but this on purpose, bought land that was quite rocky. For those of you who know the Fernwood area, the upper Fernwood, the so-called high Fernwood area, is very rocky. And of course, that wasn't good for agriculture, so it was cheaper than buying good agricultural land. Now, he continued to work with Pemberton, and they did a amount of surveying along the South Island. I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to Pemberton. Pierce himself succeeded Pemberton as a surveyor general of Vancouver Island in 1864. He also was in government. He had a seat on the executive council. And he eventually became the chief commissioner of land and works. And as I mentioned, he married twice. Initially, his first wife was Mary Letitia Pierce, and this is her grave here. And she died at the very young age of 32, on Christmas 1872. which was just before the Ross Bay Cemetery officially opened. It was going to open March 1873. So by rights, she should have been buried in the old Cloverdale Street burying ground downtown. But Benjamin was on the cemetery board, so he managed to sneak her in here before it opened, because otherwise she would have been buried there and he would have been buried here, and they wouldn't have been together in death, which even today, many couples want to have their graves together. Now, a few years after she died, Benjamin remarried to Jenny, and she was a cousin of Pemberton, who he had worked with. And she was about 20 years younger than him. And she turned into Fernwood, their estate, as a real social center of Victoria. So people, it's a great gathering place. She was a very prominent hostess. And they had a daughter, Beatrice, who's also buried here. She only lived to the age of 24, and she died in 1901 from a heart condition. Her mother was down in California at the time for her health, so she wasn't here when her daughter died. And strangely enough, Jenny, the mother, lived for another 50 years, so she in fact was quite healthy. Benjamin died a year after their daughter in 1902, and Jenny lived on in Fernwood, in the house, Fernwood, for another 50 years, 150 years, and died just over 100 years old in 1954. So, you know, considering all that Pierce did in terms of surveying and all that kind of thing, it's kind of surprising that there's a street named after him, or Pierce's name doesn't live on. It's all to do with the house, Fernwood. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John, and he's going to continue on from here for the next few minutes.
Thank you, Yvonne. And we're not going very far right now. We're in the old Anglican section of the cemetery. The first several graves are in that section, but we will be going to some of the other areas as well. The Presbyterian section, the Methodist section, Reformed Episcopal section. So we're not going too far. There are several graves here that we will be talking about together. And this one is we're losing the audio. We're losing the audio. So we're standing here at the grave of the Work family. You can see the name inscribed here. The stone is a little bit dirty, so it's more difficult to see. This is the family, a very large family of John and Josette Work. They had 10 children. John himself is not buried here. He was buried at the old burying ground, or Pioneer Square. He died in 1861 at Christmas time, and he was a long-time employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. In fact, he rose to the position of chief factor, which is the highest rank in the system. He was from Ireland and came out here as a very young man, arrived in the West, and he was stationed at a place very close to where Walla Walla, Washington is now, just along the Columbia River, and he was in charge of the Snake River area, and that's where he met Josette. Josette Lagasse, she was Métis. Her father was a French-Canadian fur trader. Her mother was an Indigenous woman from that area. And when they married, in the custom of the country, they traveled extensively down to California and eventually all over this western area, living and trading in areas from California all the way to Alaska. They lived in a number of those places, including farther north at Fort Simpson, near the Alaska Panhandle. But in 1849, Work decided that they should probably come down to Victoria. James Douglas had just moved here. They were very close colleagues, and Josette and Amelia Douglas were close friends. Land was not available for sale yet, but within a year or two, the Hudson's Bay Company had made agreements with the native people, the so-called Douglas Treaties, and the land was made available for sale. And John Work was able to buy hundreds and hundreds of acres that eventually formed the 1,000+ acres of Hillside Farm. And the farmhouse where John and Josette and their numerous children live is no longer standing, but it stood near the corner of what is now Vancouver Street and Kings Road. John died in 1861, as I mentioned. Josette continued to live on the farm, and their various children married. There were 3 sons, and it's often said that the sons did not amount to very much, but there are 3 streets, John, Henry, and David, that were named after them. But the daughters all seemed to marry fairly well to people that were influential or prominent in early day Victoria. And we're going to be talking about street names. Well, first of all, Hillside Avenue, the name of the street that runs right through their farm, is the main street that we'll talk about for the Work family. But each one of the daughters also inherited a portion of the property after Josette died, and each one of the daughters or their husbands, I'm quite sure whether the streets were named after the daughters or the husbands, let's just assume they were named after both, names that will be familiar to many of you in the area around Quadra and Hillside. So we have Graham Street, we have Pryor Street, we have Jackson Street. 3 of the daughters married men with those last names. And also one of the daughters, Kate, married a man by the name of Charles Wentworth Wallace. No Wallace Street, not now, but there used to be, because many of the names of the streets all through Victoria, but in that area in particular, have changed over the years. And so what used to be Wallace Street, we now call Vancouver Street. And Vancouver Street runs all the way from Beacon Hill Park in the Fairfield neighborhood all the way up to Summit Hill across Hillside Avenue. Some of the streets in that area are a little bit more obscure. And there was a street called Jones, but it's now called the Rise. Very lovely street on Summit Hill. And some of the grandchildren of John and Josette Work also have their names honored. There's a very short street just off Cook Street called Basil Avenue. That was named after Basil Graham, one of the sons, and another grandson, and another one, Montrose. Graham Montrose is another street on Summit Hill. But there's one street that I've always been curious about, and I was able to find the answer in preparation for this tour, and that is Blackwood. Blackwood, who was that? Well, it turns out that one of the daughters of Kate Work, who married Charles Wentworth Wallace, they had 4 children, by the way, and they were the ones that started Point Alice House. They built the first wing in 1861. But it's said that Charles squandered his money and his wife's money and wasn't very nice to her generally. Kate had 4 children. 3 of them died as infants, but one child, Eliza, outlived her mother by many years. And she was raised, after Kate died, by Josette Work, by her grandmother. And when she married a man by the name of Edward Blackwood. And so we have names of all of the daughters and some of the grandchildren named in that area around Hillside and Quadra. We're going to run into one other a little bit later on. There was one of the daughters who married a man who was in charge of Fort Nisqually, where Tacoma is today. I'll leave that a secret until we get to their grave a little bit later on. But right now, we're going to go to the grave of the Talmies, and it is right over here. Yvonne's pointing the way. I said we were going to the Talmy grave, but here it says Jane Work. That's because Dr. William Fraser Talmy married the oldest daughter of John and Josette Work. Her name was Jane. Of course, Dr. William Fraser Talmy was a fascinating character. In fact, the whole family was. Perhaps as we're talking about this grave, we can look at the various sides. At the Work grave, the senior Work, I mentioned, was buried at the old burying ground. But here, most of the Talmys are buried at this grave, at least the early ones. John Work Talmy is on this side, and William Fraser Talmy was from Inverness in Scotland. And at a very early age, because he was a very bright young man, he moved to Glasgow, where he went to Glasgow University and studied medicine. And it was only he was only just a young man. He was barely 20 years old when he signed up for a term with the Hudson's Bay Company. And for 5.5 months on the Ganymede, he went around Cape Horn and arrived at Port Vancouver. This was in 1830, 1831. He studied along the way. It's often said that he was probably one of the very few who really enjoyed the isolation of being on board ship for 5.5 months, because he had brought a huge crate of books and he studied everything along the way. He did work for the Hudson's Bay Company. They did need doctors, but they also needed men who knew how to handle affairs, and so he was put in charge of several of the Hudson's Bay Company posts. And like many of those men, were stationed to different places all along the coast. But eventually, he was the one in charge of Fort Nisqually, where Tacoma, Washington is today. And it's not that far from Victoria. The boats used to go back and forth between the two places. But perhaps like the works, the Ptolemies decided that they really needed to be closer to some of their friends. They were close colleagues of the Douglas family. And so when the land was made available for sale in the early 1850s, Dr. William Fraser Ptolemy bought a large tract of land. And just before that, he had married Jane Worth, so perhaps it would be fitting that they wanted to be neighbors. And so the Worth property was straddling Hillside Avenue from Bay Street north to Summit Hill. And Dr. Ptolemy decided to buy the piece of property to the north of that, roughly starting where Ptolemy Avenue is, running north beyond that. And the streets in that area bear the names of members of the family. Ptolemy itself, there is a street named after where he came from, Inverness, where he studied, Glasgow, and also within the property area, Ardersier, one of his relatives, came out from Scotland, and the street was named after her. But probably the most interesting one is a street named after their house. Yvonne mentioned that the Pierce's house, Fernwood, gave its name to Fernwood neighborhood and Fernwood Road, but in fact, the Ptolemy's house was called Cloverdale. And so Cloverdale Avenue is one of the main streets running through their old estate. Their house, like many of the other old houses, is gone. It's burned down in the early 1960s. But if you want to see some timbers from that house, they had salvaged some timbers when Fort Victoria was being dismantled and incorporated them into an addition to their house. And in the 1960s, when the house was taken down, some of those timbers were saved. And if you go to the third floor of the Royal BC Museum and look at the model, the very good model of Fort Victoria, it's on a base of timbers that came from the Ptolemy House, Cloverdale, and originally from Fort Victoria itself. So we'll leave the Ptolemies and think about the streets that were named after their family and their connections. And we're not going too far at all, so just guide Paul around here. And we're going to be going this way. The audio is on? Is it on? Back on? Okay. Now this is a grave that we have stopped at a number of times. In fact, Peter Grant, who gives tours for us quite often, has done entire tours about the Mcneil family. Mcneil Bay, or Shoal Bay, as it's sometimes called, in South Oak Bay, was named after them, and Mcneil Avenue, or appropriate to our tour topic today of street names. So who were the Mcneils? Well, it's very, very difficult to see because the stone is covered with moss and lichen. It's made of sandstone. But if you could read between the moss and lichen, you would see that this is the grave of Captain William Henry Mcneil. He was from the States. And Captain Mcneil came out in the period just around 1830. He had his own schooner, his own trading ship, in rivalry with the Hudson's Bay Company, but along with many others, particularly from the United States, they were very prolific in the fur trade. And William McNeil's boat was called the Llama. He was very good at trading, and so good, in fact, that the Hudson's Bay Company was very worried about the competition. And they tried to do various nefarious things to stop him from trading, but in the end, the easiest way was to bring him on board. And they made a deal that Captain McNeil could not refuse. And so they basically bought the boat and hired him as the captain of the Llama. And he continued to do trading up and down the coast, becoming very, very good at it, even better at it. And when the Hudson's Bay Company brought out the very first steamship to be on the North Pacific coast, SS Beaver, McNeil's reputation as a captain was so good, they decided to make him the captain of that newfangled contraption that clattered and went up and down the coast, burning huge amounts of cordial. And there are places, Port McNeil, Beaver Cove, named after McNeil and his boat. But here in Oak Bay, we have Mcneil Avenue. The property basically ran from Fairfield Road, Beach Drive, all the way through to an area not too far from Anderson Hill. And when McNeil was up the coast, he would come back and he would nose his boat into Enterprise Channel. One of his last boats was the Enterprise. He would toot the whistle, and that would give a chance for his son, also William, to hitch up the horse and head into town and be at the dock at the Hudson's Bay Company wharf in time to meet the boat and then take Dad home. And so Enterprise Channel between Trial Island and Oak Bay is named after them. And when Captain McNeil died, he left his estate to his children. I don't believe they ended up naming the streets after themselves. They're named other things: Central, Victoria, Queen Anne, and so on. But nonetheless, Captain McNeil was a very important individual here, and perhaps we shouldn't leave without mentioning his wife, Martha. She was a Mishka woman and was McNeil's second wife. His first wife was Ida. She died before McNeil purchased the land here in Victoria, but a very prominent family. And one of their sons married Macaulay. And those are other names we're not going to get into today, but Macaulay Street in Esquimalt was named after them. So lots of names derived from this family as well. Now, Yvonne is standing right over there, and she's going to take us to the next screen.
Is the sound okay? Good. All right. So we're here at the grave of John Grant, and as it says, Mayor of Victoria. Well, Grant Street runs from through Spring Ridge and Fernwood. Spring Ridge being the neighborhood that's just to the west of Fernwood, but actually we think of Fernwood as the whole thing now. Nobody thinks of that as Spring Ridge. And it runs from Cook to Belmont, and it borders the south side of Victoria High School. So that's Grant Street, and it was named after John Grant, as it says on his marker here, a mayor of Victoria, but a man of many adventures. I first came across John Grant when I was doing my gold rush tours. Some of you may recall that for many summers I did gold rush tours every summer in the cemetery, and I was always researching new people. And I came across John Grant because of his involvement in the Grouse Creek War, as it was called, which is much referenced only occasion of unlawful behavior during our gold rushes. And what it involved was something that, for those of us of a certain age who remember Westerns and that, involved claim jumping, which was the illegal taking over of a gold claim by someone. In this case, John Grant was one of the ringleaders of the Canadian Company. And what they did was they jumped a claim by the Grouse Creek Flume Company. So Grouse Creek had staked this claim in the mid-1860s up in the Barkerville area, which is where the Caribou Gold Rush was underway. but they hadn't developed it. So it was just lying there, just nothing happening. So the Canadian company moved in on it. And of course, this was not legal, and the Grouse Creek Company objected. But the Canadian company stood their ground and continued to work the claim. So the law was called in. In fact, the district magistrate, Mr. Ball, swore in that 25 special constables to come in and lay down the law to the Canadian company. The Canadian company ignored this and continued to work the claim, but negotiations started. So lengthy negotiations resolved nothing. The Canadian company continued to work the claim, and so the magistrate cabled the governor to send in the Marines. So 25 Marines were sent up to enforce the law. However, any violence was averted because, of course, this wasn't a big fear that there would actually be a battle. And that nothing actually happened other than the Canadian company gentlemen were arrested. They were put in jail for a very short time, and apparently they were well supported by their supporters with lots of food and liquor. And then a court case found against them, and the Grouse Creek Flume Company got their claim back. So, but Grant himself continued to be involved in gold rushes for many years after that. He formed a company with two other gentlemen called Galbraith, Grant, and Cook, and he moved into the Cassiar gold rush in the 1870s up north, and they ran a string of stores for the prospectors. Grant himself lived during the summer up there and here in Victoria in the winter, just like the prospectors did. A lot of prospectors did not stay up in the north during the winter. They always came down to Victoria. And so he did very well by that. He actually ran for election and became the MLA for the Cassiar through 2 sessions, then eventually settled more permanently in Victoria and became an MLA for Victoria, as well as a member of City Council, which, as we know now, is not allowed, seeing as we just had that recently where someone ran for MLA and had to resign from council. And he then was elected 4 terms of mayor here in Victoria. At that time, the mayor terms were only 1 year, so 4 years as mayor. While he was mayor, our library was established. That was the first establishment of the library. And boulevards were beautified with the addition of trees to many of the boulevards. And also the houses were numbered and streets were named. The actual marked, they had already had names, but they were marked out better apparently. Now, he's obviously still felt the pull of the gold fields, because when the Klondike Gold Rush started at the end of the 1800s, he went up there to see if he could set up a freighting business to move freight from Skagway into Dawson. But that fell apart under mismanagement. We don't know if it was his mismanagement or somebody else's, but it was not a success. However, he did come back to Victoria eventually, but he did spend several years up there. And again, he was in government up there and worked for, eventually had a job with the Dominion government up there, although I haven't been able to figure out what that was. Nobody seems to mention that. He eventually came back to Victoria in 1914. So he spent quite a few years up there, about 14 years up there, and then died in 1919 here in Victoria at age 79. So a long and eventful life, and he has that street to memorialize it. So now we're just going over here to the Pemberton one. Okay, so here we are at the very large, very impressive Pemberton Monument. And of course, we've already heard Joseph Pemberton's name several times. After all, he was very important in the whole surveying of this part of Vancouver Island, and actually up island as well. And so, you know, people want to relate on I'm standing with my back to the wind, and I'm hoping that's so. How can Liz give an indication, and how's the sound? Am I being heard? Okay. It is there. Okay. as I say, I'm trying to keep my back
That's
to
better.
it. Okay, so Joseph Despard Pemberton, he was an engineer, a surveyor, a farmer, a justice of the peace, and a businessman. He was a big man here in Victoria all around. He came originally from Ireland, where he had trained to become a professional engineer and surveyor. And he came out to Vancouver Island in 1852. And he, in 1854, Victoria, he started work the next day as soon as he arrived. And then in 1852 was when he joined forces with Benjamin Pierce as his assistant. And they started all of that surveying that I talked about that Pierce was involved in as well with Pemberton. So they surveyed the South Island. Pemberton also surveyed up the coast, the east coast of the island, as far as Nanaimo fields, coal fields, and eventually also on the west coast. They laid out the town site of Victoria, which was divided up into different blocks, including town, suburban, and country lands. There was a set aside property set aside for the governor, for school, church, and a park. He also did work over on the mainland. In 1858, with the beginning of the gold rush, of course, things got really active over on the mainland. So he was involved in laying out the town sites for Fort Yale, that became Yale, Fort Hope, that became Hope, Port Douglas, that became Douglas, which basically doesn't hardly exist anymore. And he also, of course, was involved eventually in Pemberton, BC, which is that's his name is on that. Here in Victoria, of course, like Pierce, he picked out his property very well because he knew what all the property was. He had a huge estate that extended from inside the Victoria boundaries all the way well into Oak Bay, and he called it Gonzales. So anything Gonzales that you hear, Gonzales Bay and Gonzales Street or Road, I'm not sure which it is. All of that Gonzales was the name of Joseph Pemberton's estate. And as I say, it was a very large one, and some of his children lived on it as well. He built houses. It's my hat. Eventually when he had arrived here initially in 1851, of course, he'd been working for the Hudson's Bay Company, which basically managed the Vancouver Island, was still under the auspices of the Hudson's Bay Company. But then eventually he split from them and joined the colonial government as the Surveyor General for that as well. He served on the House of Assembly and also the Legislative Council. And in 1867, when Canada formed the East, he put forward a resolution saying, quote, calling for, quote, the admission of British Columbia into the Confederation on fair and equitable terms when and if the colony should decide to join. Of course, it took a few years after that for that happened. In 1887, he joined with his son Frederick to set up the J.D. Pemberton and Son Company, which was the business was for surveying, engineering work, real estate, and financial agents. And of course, the Pemberton name is still well known here in Victoria, and that is a direct result of Joseph Despard Pemberton and his son Frederick. So we have, though, strangely, only a tiny little road named Pemberton Road here in Victoria, just a little short thing. Although, of course, he does have a hotel, Pemberton, BC, named after him. But it just seems funny that here in Victoria, that's such a little tiny little street after him. There are two other streets that are connected besides the ones named Gonzales, all the things named Gonzales. And one is Despard Avenue up here off St. Charles, and Warren Gardens there as well. And those two are named after his two grandsons who died in the First World War. Despard Pemberton was in the Royal Flying Corps and was shot down over France and is buried there. And Warren was killed in an accident while he was in training with the Royal Flying Corps in England, and he's buried there. And their names are on the tombstone here, memorializing them even though they're not here. And there's quite a few families here in Victoria who chose to do that, where their sons had died overseas, and they have included the names of the sons on their graves. And now we're just going to go down that way.
Can't hear John.
The width has been getting a little bit fierce, so I'll be careful where I stand. We're going to the grave of the Finlayson family right here. Trying to stand with the over here. And right on the front of the tombstone, the name Roderick Finlayson, born in Rossshire in Scotland. And he married Sarah Work, one of the many daughters of John and Josette Work we talked about earlier. She outlived him by about 15 years. And Roderick Finlayson was another career member of the fur trade, Hudson's Bay Company primarily, and arrived on the West Coast and was put in charge of the farming operation of the Hudson's Bay Company at Howlett's Portage. The Hudson's Bay Company in the 1830s had an agreement with the Russian Americans. Can't grow too much produce in Alaska, at least you couldn't then before hybrids. So the Hudson's Bay Company made a deal. They would have farms and they would provide what the Russian Americans needed. And Finlayson was in charge of one of several farms that was now Washington State along the I-5, not too far from the small town of Toledo, Washington. But eventually he moved to other places. He was in charge of posts farther up the coast. But in 1843, when Fort Victoria was under construction, site chosen by James Douglas, but Douglas didn't stay, and he left the work in charge of Charles. Imagine the wind is getting rather fierce, and so I'm just going to ask Paul to aim the camera at the monument because I'm trying to disperse. I'm just going to see if it's any different. It is a little bit better. Indeed, Roderick Finlayson came down in 1843 to work under Charles Ross. Douglas chose the site for Fort Victoria, but Ross was put in charge of the actual construction. And when the fort was completed, Ross remained as the man in charge of the fort. However, unfortunately, Ross was not well, and we'll talk a little bit more about his family later on. But Roderick Finlayson, only in his 20s, was put in charge of the fort. And so from 1844 until 1849, when James Douglas arrived on the scene, moving up from Fort Vancouver, Roderick Finlayson was in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company post here. He stayed on. His family remained in Victoria, and Roderick Finlayson was the treasurer for the Hudson's Bay Company. But as Yvonne mentioned with the Pembertons, many of the early families were able to buy choice pieces of land, and Finlayson, as the treasurer, was able to purchase a huge piece of land directly north of the fort, where Victoria stood close to the downtown Victoria today. James Douglas chose a big piece of land immediately east of the fort in what is now Fairfield, and Finlayson chose the piece immediately north of the fort. And it was a neat tract of land on the harbor at Rock Bay, running east, all the way to the parts of Pemberton. And he built a huge house for his family, for he and Sarah and their numerous children. And they made their house very comfortable. So notwithstanding, we're standing in the on Douglas Street, not too far from the armories, in fact, almost exactly where the Dairy Queen is. If you know that place, just south of Bay Street on Douglas Street. When Finlayson died, his estate was subdivided eventually, and it was a very large area. And I'm not aware that there were streets, except for Finlayson Street, in the area named after his family. Finlayson Street is not a very long street. It runs from just about where Mayfair Mall is, and it runs east to about Cedarville Road. So now we're going to leave the Finlayson grave, and Yvonne has
Stelly. I'm going to try and stand in the little shelter of the very large monument, and hopefully that will help. So of course, George Stelly's name lives on in the very prominent Stelly's Crossroad up on the Sandwich Peninsula, and also of course there's the school that's on that Stelly's. But there's also a very short street, like just a half a block long, called Stelly Street in Pemberton, why that's there later on. Yeah, but can you at least hear me? Okay, I'll just keep going. So, George Stelly was an interesting fella, came from Switzerland. He was born in Switzerland. He went to the US before he came here, like so many people did. And he was 26 when he went to the US, and he went first to New Orleans. So many of them went to New York, but he went to New Orleans first. And then he worked his way up the Mississippi, all the way up to St. Louis. And there he got work driving a team of oxen, a 12 oxen team, and plowing on farmland up in that area. Apparently he didn't like that work very much. It must have been very hard work indeed. And according to his obituary in the Colonist, he found that work irksome. I think that's probably putting it mildly. He then went to Iowa, and in 1854 he headed west to California in a wagon train. They took quite a few, 6 months to get to California. They were attacked by Indians. Their oxen were stolen, but they made it. He stayed for a while, and he had some success apparently until he heard a few years later of the Fraser River Gold Rush, and like so many people, he was pulled up here by that. Now he got here in May 1858, so he was one of the early arrivals because it had just started in April. So there was no commercial transport over to the mainland. So he and 3 other fellows got in a little boat and rowed. They rowed over to Main Island, to Miners Bay. They camped out there, and then they rowed across the Strait of Georgia and up the Fraser. I can't imagine what that was like, but that was the way it was done until there was actual commercial transportation available. They made it into the Fraser, they were mining some of the cars there, but they didn't have much success. They were so desperate because they had an upset of their boat and they lost a lot of their stuff. So they wanted to stay as long as possible, and they stayed too long, and they ended up having to winter over on the Fraser. Well, they nearly starved to death. They hardly had anything. But they survived that and came back to Victoria in the spring. Now, Stelly wanted to go back to California where he'd done so well, but he couldn't afford it. So he stayed here. So he got some work, probably in construction, because it was booming with the gold rush, and Victoria had been such a tiny place when he started, and they needed lots of buildings. And he saved enough money that he got himself a mule and a cart. And he started collecting water at the spring in Spring Ridge and driving it in and delivering it door to door in Victoria. So he got the nickname George the Waterman. And so that's why there is a little street in Spring Ridge named Stelly. But he did very well with that as well. And eventually he began doing contracting and freighting, carrying freight around the area. And so he had got enough money to buy land out on the Sandwich Peninsula and built up quite a large farm out there, which is why the Stelly's Crossroad is there, because that's where his farm was. He also, when he was doing the contracting, he owned the Clarence Block, which is the corner of Yates and Douglas, and built a big building there. He died in 1913 at the age of 88. Survived by only one son, George. And there was a lovely description, of course, in these big funerals, and he would have had a very large funeral because he was so well known. The obituaries always describe the floral tributes that people put out. And for him, there was carnations and orchids. So that must have been quite impressive. So now we're going down in this direction, and John's going to continue.
See, but the waves are just rolling at Rock Bay. Real small boat, I guess.
We're not picking you up.
At all?
No, I am.
Okay. So we have here the grave of Matthias Rowland, like Eliza. And Matthias Rowland was a character. Matthias Rowland was, in fact, one of the passengers on board the Norman Morrison when Dr. John Sebastian Pemberton came out in 1850. We know that Rowland was a poet. He was known for his writing. He remained a book much of his life. He came out and worked at the Hudson's Bay Burnside Park and ran a hotel, the Burnside Hotel, just around where the Forestry Research Station is. In fact, Rowland's property occupied much of that area between the Milligan Center, the Forestry Research Center, and all the way up Hillside Avenue over to Cary Road. It was quite a large, rather irregular piece of property. He did quite well for himself. He raised pigs, among other things. He ran his hotel, which seemed to bring him in a fair bit of money. But probably one of his less known occupations, one that he wasn't talking about, was the fact that he was also the hangman, employed by the Hudson's Bay Company back in the early 1850s, when people were hanged. And unfortunately, many of the ones who were hanged in those early days were indigenous people. Rowland was the hangman, but nobody knew who it was. We've only been able to discover this because of the records, the accounts of the Hudson's Bay Company. Rowland, of course, would wear a black hood, and perhaps I feel quite appropriate at the moment because I'm also wearing a black hood, trying to keep the wind down. But indeed, Rowland would step forward and put the noose around the prisoner's neck and pull the bolt. And for this, he received the princely sum of £10 for execution. £10 was a lot of money back in the 1850s because the average laborer for the Hudson's Bay Company only earned £17 a year, so almost half, slightly more than half of an annual income. So Rowland's proclivity for violence made sure that we had no qualms about what we were doing. Anyway, we're including him on the tour today, not because of that, but because there's a very small street. It's called Cloverdale Avenue, and it's a little tiny street just off Cary Road on the old property that Rowland once owned. And now, I'm going to turn it back to Yvonne, and we're going to head a little bit farther away this time, and hopefully try to stay out of the wind.
And the wind down here is really warm.
Okay, so you're going to head up to these. Well, we've got a bit of a walk now. We had originally planned to do some down by closer to the water, but given the current wind situation, that's not practical. So we're going to cut across country here and go to one of the ones up here. Not only is it very windy down there, but if any of you have been in the cemetery recently and have been down to that part of the cemetery, the old Catholic section, it's literally floating in water. The ground has gotten so saturated down there that it's that there are some of the graves are actually some of the markers are surrounded by water. Quite disturbing. But now we have beautiful sunshine, and what a difference it's made to how everything feels. it felt so cold when we started the tour, and now the sun has just come out and just made a huge difference. So we're going up in this direction up toward the Dean's Monument, which is up behind Douglas. So beautiful sunshine. In hopes of not having too much trouble with the wind. So there is a street in Sandwich, no. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say it. Yes, I guess it's below Lansdowne, so that means it's in Sandwich. And it runs from Lansdowne down to as far as Halsgreen. And it's called Dean Street. But actually, it should be called Dean's with an S Street. As John mentioned, there were, of course, streets, got changed, names changed and that. And also street names sometimes got sort of corrupted in a way. And that's exactly what happened with Dean Street. At some point, when somebody was recording the name of this street, they left off the S. Now the Deans, George and Annie Deans, came with their brother, George's brother James, to the Victoria area with Kenneth Mackenzie. Remember Mackenzie from the very beginning of the tour? That was one of they were among the people that Mackenzie came to work regularly on the farm. They did work on the farm for a while, but they were very unhappy under Mackenzie. He certainly, from what I've read in some reports, that he had a reputation as being quite the tough manager. And so they left and went back to the fort and found work around the fort. George was a carpenter and Annie took in sewing. And so they eventually saved enough money to buy land. Of course, this was their big dream, to actually own land and have a farm of their own. And so they bought land out where Camosun College is now, where the Young Building is. And that's where their farm Oakvale was established. And so that's why the street comes down there. They had quite a nice property there. They had about 200 acres. And Annie wrote home in 1855 to say, "We have got a farm of 200 acres. We have got 5 cows, and I expect we will have some horses this summer." So there was a lot of expense in getting started, but they worked very hard and felt that, of course, farming was a good prospect for them because, of course, Victoria was a growing place, and there was lots of people coming in, especially once the gold rushes started. So farming worked out very well. The prices of produce were quite high. They ended up having 8 children in total, 2 of whom died. And but the worst was that in 1879, George died. He was only in his 40s. He was 48. Now, of course, by that time, 1879, they had some help with the children growing up, and of course, James Deans, the brother, was there and helping with the farm. And so the farm continued on, and the 1901 census showed that George Jr. was head of the farm, with brother John also working there, and 2 sisters were living there as well. One of whom married the farmhand. One thing that was in the early days when I was talking about the Deans was how they ended up with this spectacular monument when they were just farmers. No other farmers in the cemetery have a spectacular monument like this. It is one of the most amazing in the cemetery. But I've come to the conclusion that the reason we have this monument is not because of Annie, because of the brother James. James became quite prominent. He actually has an interest in the community, shared researcher on native subjects and author. He's a published author of native studies. He worked with the very famous anthropologist Franz Boas in studying native cultures locally. And so I'm quite sure that the money that became available for this monument came from James Dean's. But the street, Dean Street, is definitely named after George and Annie's farm. And so now we're going to help.
And I'm not sure why the Helmkins are buried in the Presbyterian section of the cemetery, because they were members of the Anglican Evangelical Reformed Episcopal Church. Borders area just south of Edmonton. Perhaps that's where the Presbyterian connection came in. So the Helmkin grave okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. So the Helmkin grave is one that we have included a number of times. It's a rather unusual grave. First of all, it's irregularly shaped. It's got a curving made of sandstone. The name Helmkin, especially as it applies to street names in Victoria, is actually most appropriate about Dr. John Sebastian Helmkin, the patriarch of Pemberton, who came out from London in 1850 to work for 5 years for the Hudson's Bay Company. As a doctor, he would make enough money, he thought, to go back to London to buy his own medical practice. It worked because the day he arrived at Port Victoria after a long voyage around Cape Horn, he saw Cecilia Douglas, 14 years old, the oldest daughter of James and Amelia Douglas. They fell in love, and 2 years later they were married at Christmas time, 1852. Very famous love story. Well, the Dr. and Mrs. Helmkin lived for a few years in the house they built for themselves, Helmkin House, beside what is now the Royal BC Museum. The Douglas House stood there. That's why the two houses were so close together. Of course, the Douglas House is long gone. The Helmkin House survives. So Dr. John Sebastian Helmkin is buried at Pioneer Square. His wife, Cecilia Douglas, died when she was only 35, having given birth to 7 children. She died shortly after the birth of the 7th one. And she was buried in the old burying ground, the only place really in town for people to be buried in those days. That cemetery closed in 1873, and Ross Bay Cemetery took its place. But Dr. Helmkin lived on, never remarrying, until he was 96 years old. When he died in 1920, he was, up until the moment he died, the oldest living individual in British Columbia. Special permission was given for him to be buried in his wife's tomb at Pioneer Square, which had been closed since 1873. But the street, Helmkin Avenue, southern Peter Royal, is named after him because he owned a huge tract of land. The property close in was already sold, purchased by people like Douglas, Finlayson, Palmy, Worth, and so on. So Helmkin purchased a piece of land out in the country. I'm not sure that he actually farmed it, but he was farming on the property. And when he died, the property eventually went in hands of his son, Dr. Jim. Actually, Dr. Jim Helmkin had preceded. I'm getting ahead of myself. Dr. Helmkin and Cecilia had 7 children. 3 died as babies. 4 survived, 2 boys and 2 girls. The oldest boy, Dr. Jim Helmken, was a medical doctor here in Victoria, and it's a bit confusing because there were 2 doctors Helmken. The senior Dr. Helmken, the base of North Victoria, and Dr. Jim Helmken. And Dr. Jim Helmken, whose grave Paul is showing you here, was in fact one of the people who was very involved in getting the program for nurses training established at the Royal Jubilee at the St. Joseph's Hospital. And when Dr. Helmken, whose grave you see here, died in 1919, there was a line of nurses from the nursing school who lined the steps of the church as he was taken from the Church of Our Lord to be buried here. The name Helmken lives on in a number of different places, but particularly Helmken Road out in New Royal. It was named after the family, really not specifically for Dr. Helmken himself, because the property remained within the Helmken family several generations, quite a long time. There are no members of the Helmken family by that name living in Victoria, although there are certainly lots of descendants around. So we have one more grave to visit, and that's one that Yvonne is going to tell us about. And that one isn't too far away. No, we've decided because of the wind, it's probably difficult to continue on. And I think we're over 3 o'clock. So I'll stand close to Yvonne so you can see us both, still 6 feet apart. But in fact, for us, it's been fun because actually the weather has improved and the sky is blue and the rain has stopped. Wish that
Your sunny personality.
would stop.
Yeah. Yes,
But
indeed.
indeed, thank you for bearing with us, and we will resume this topic another time, perhaps, because there are so many other people buried here at Ross Bay Cemetery. Have streets named after the great Victoria area.
Yeah, especially down by the water, which we haven't been able to get to. But and so yes, thank you everybody for sticking with us, I hope. And next week I will be doing my annual symbolism tour, a new tour in here, maybe depending on the weather. We'll see. No, definitely they'll be doing my symbolism tour next Sunday. So I'm hoping that you can join us then as well. So thanks everybody, and thank you, John, as well for this. Lots of work. And of course, Paul and Steve here and Liz at the other end. Thanks to everybody. Really appreciate the help and support.
Thanks for tuning in.